A man tried to open the emergency door on a flight, but what they found in his bag revealed a terrifying secret that could change everything you thought you knew. This is a story of courage, truth, and redemption, a gripping journey that will keep you hooked until the very last word. Before we begin, let me know where you're watching from and drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts as we dive into this incredible journey together. The morning sun cast a golden hue over the tarmac at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport as travelers hustled through the terminal, dragging roller bags, sipping lukewarm coffee, and glancing at departure boards glowing blue and white. Among the stream of passengers weaving through Gate C-17 was a man who barely stood out, a middle-aged figure in a dark olive windbreaker, jeans, and sneakers, his hair graying at the temples, his face neither forgettable nor memorable. Daniel Reed. To the gate agents, he was just another passenger booked on Delta Flight 227 to Denver. To everyone else, he was invisible. The Boeing 737 began boarding promptly at 8:45 a.m. Families jostled for position. Parents herding kids. A businessman shouted into a Bluetooth headset about quarterly losses. Daniel stood still at the back of the line, his gaze steady on the tarmac outside. He clutched a navy blue duffel bag, unmarked, zipped tight, held close to his chest like it carried something sacred or dangerous. A flight attendant greeted him with a perfunctory smile as he stepped onto the plane. "Good morning, welcome aboard," she said. Daniel nodded politely and moved down the narrow aisle, avoiding eye contact. He settled into seat 21, a window seat near the rear of the plane. As passengers filled in around him, Daniel's eyes flicked toward the emergency exit door just 2 rows ahead, then back to his lap. 30 minutes later, Flight 227 roared down the runway and climbed into the cold, crisp air. At cruising altitude, the fastened seatbelt sign chimed off, and passengers began to relax. Flight attendants rolled their carts down the aisles, offering pretzels and soda. Laughter echoed from a family traveling with twin toddlers in row 10. A woman in business class ordered a Bloody Mary with extra Tabasco. Daniel sat still. He hadn't touched his tray table. He hadn't spoken to the young man in the middle seat beside him, who wore headphones and watched something on his phone. Daniel's hands were folded, his jaw tense. From time to time, he reached into his jacket and touched something, maybe a photo, maybe nothing at all. His eyes stayed on the aisle. 30,000 feet above the Rocky Mountains, the peace shattered. It began with a low murmur of surprise. A man was standing near the emergency door, gripping the handle. A gasp. Then voices, urgent, panicked. "Hey, sit down," someone shouted. "Is he trying to open the door?" Daniel Reed stood at row 19, his hands on the emergency lever, eyes locked on the window. He mumbled something unintelligible. A few rows back, a former Army Ranger named Caleb Nash leaped up, lunging across the aisle. His shoulder hit Daniel square in the ribs. The 2 men slammed into the seats. A flight attendant screamed. Another ran to the cockpit. Daniel fought back, not wildly, but desperately, as if he had to finish what he started. But Nash was younger, stronger, and trained. Within seconds, he had Daniel pinned to the floor, knee in his back. Passengers cried. Some prayed. A child wailed. One woman fainted. The cockpit door opened slightly, and a flight attendant passed a note to the captain. Within minutes, the plane began descending. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice crackled over the speakers. "This is your captain speaking. Due to an onboard disturbance, we will be making an emergency landing at Salt Lake City International Airport. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Meanwhile, Daniel lay motionless beneath Nash's grip, his chest heaving, eyes unfocused. He didn't resist anymore. As the flight crew cuffed him with plastic ties, one of the attendants, Melissa Carter, knelt beside him and heard him whisper something strange, voice hoarse and cracked. "She told me this would save lives." Melissa blinked. "What?" Daniel just closed his eyes. Below them, the Utah desert stretched out, silent and unaware. Emergency crews stood ready on the tarmac as Flight 227 approached. None of the passengers yet knew who the man was, why he had tried to open that door, or what was inside the bag he had refused to stow beneath the seat. But soon the world would. 48 hours before the incident aboard Flight 227, the sky over Tacoma, Washington, was a dull blanket of gray, drizzling rain in fine sheets against the cracked sidewalks of a quiet suburb. In a modest single-story house on Cedar Lane, Daniel Reed stood in the dim kitchen, staring at a cold cup of black coffee. The TV muttered in the background. Local news, weather, static. Daniel didn't hear it. His mind was elsewhere. He had barely touched the eggs he scrambled an hour earlier. On the table beside him sat a small, blue duffel bag, half-zipped, waiting. He moved slowly, almost methodically. He wiped his hands on a dish towel, walked to the living room, and opened a drawer in an old wooden cabinet. Inside was a photograph, worn at the edges, creased from too much folding. In it, a young woman in an Army combat uniform stood, grinning beside a Humvee in the Afghan desert. Her name, Tape Red Reed. Her smile was radiant. She was his daughter, Sergeant Emily Reed, and she had been dead for over 2 years. Daniel looked at the photo for a long time, then gently placed it inside a plastic folder and slid it into the duffel. He zipped it shut. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Daniel had lived alone for years now, ever since Emily's death shattered what was left of his world. He had retired early from teaching high school chemistry, citing stress and declining health. But the truth was, without Emily, he had nothing left to care for. His wife had passed for breast cancer a decade earlier. Emily had been their only child, his anchor, his reason. When the Army called to say she had died in a base explosion, part of a classified research mission, Daniel had asked for details. They gave him platitudes. Heroic service. A tragic accident. No further information available. He didn't buy it. Not for a second. Since then, Daniel had done little else but dig. He requested records, filed FOIAs, contacted anyone who had served with her. Most doors slammed shut. Some whispered. And a few weeks ago, a battered envelope had arrived in his mailbox with no return address. Inside, a handwritten note in Emily's unmistakable handwriting. Dad, I couldn't tell you everything, but if you found this, it means something went wrong. I need you to finish what I started. The truth can still matter. Just be careful. Alongside it had been a small flash drive and a notebook filled with her field notes. Complex biochemical formulas, coordinates, references to a project labeled Lazarus. In 3 words underlined twice. Do not trust them. Daniel had stared at the pages for days. He'd sat on his porch with the wind in his face and wondered if he was already too late. But the weight in his chest told him the opposite. She trusted him with this, and he would follow it to the end. Now, as he stood in the hallway by the front door, he looked around the house one last time. Faded photos on the wall. A worn recliner. The calendar still on last month. It was a life half-lived, a home frozen in time. He didn't expect to come back. He grabbed the duffel, stepped outside into the light drizzle, and locked the door behind him. At the train station, Daniel sat quietly in the corner of the platform coffee shop. He sipped his drink, watching people come and go. The world moved on around him, fast, loud, indifferent. At a nearby table, a man in a TSA jacket sat alone, flipping through a newspaper. Something about Daniel caught his eye. Maybe the way he sat so still. Maybe the intensity behind his pale blue eyes. They struck up a brief conversation. You traveling far? The agent asked casually. Far enough, Daniel said. Far enough to do something that matters. The TSA man frowned slightly. Everything okay? Daniel gave a small smile. It will be. Later that night, the TSA agent would report the conversation, just to be safe. But with nothing more than a vague feeling and no actionable threat, the system would do what it always does, bury it in bureaucracy. And Daniel Reed would board his flight to Denver, a man with nothing to lose and everything to prove, carrying a secret that might just bring a government to its knees or save lives beyond counting. The diner sat on the edge of faded strip mall in Spokane Valley, its neon sign flickering in the early evening gloom. Inside, the smell of frying oil and old coffee clung to the vinyl booths like a second skin. The only soundtrack was the soft clink of silverware and a muted radio playing classic country hits from a forgotten decade. Daniel Reed sat alone in a corner booth, his back to the wall, the same duffel bag from earlier resting at his feet. He sipped a black coffee that had long gone cold, his eyes fixed on nothing, thoughts racing through the murky silence of his mind. Across from him, at the counter, a man in his late 30s with a short beard and a windbreaker bearing a small Department of Homeland Security logo scrawled on the chest stirred sugar into his mug. His name was David Myers, a TSA agent returning home after 2 weeks of mandatory training in Portland. He noticed Daniel out of the corner of his eye. There was something about the way the older man sat. Rigid posture, alert gaze, fingers drumming softly on the mug's ceramic lip. The kind of presence that doesn't quite match the setting. Instinct made Myers curious. He stood, picked up his coffee, and walked toward the booths. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. Daniel looked up. His eyes were tired but sharp. "Sure," he said with a soft nod. They talked for a few minutes. Casual, surface level. "Where you from? Where you headed?" The kind of conversation that normally fades with the check. But Myers pressed a little more when he learned Daniel was flying out in the morning. "Denver?" Myers asked. "Work or vacation?" Daniel paused for a beat, then smiled faintly. "Neither. Just tying up loose ends. Family there?" "Not anymore." Myers nodded, sensing something beneath the surface. "You sure everything's all right?" Daniel's smile faded. His eyes drifted to the window. "It's strange," he said. "How people go through their whole lives never realizing how close they come to disaster. How many lives get rewritten in a second." Myers leaned in slightly, his voice quieter now. "You're not thinking of doing something, are you?" Daniel turned to face him fully. "I'm thinking of doing the right thing, even if it's too late for me." There was no menace in his voice, no anger, just the kind of calm conviction that unnerves people. Myers felt a chill run down his spine. "You in law enforcement?" Daniel asked. "Kind of. TSA." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Then maybe you'll understand soon." "What does that mean?" Daniel didn't answer. He stood, dropped a few bills on the table, and picked up his bag. "Thanks for the conversation." And just like that, he was gone, out the door and into the night. Myers sat there for a few minutes, unsure whether he'd just spoken to a depressed widower or someone preparing for something darker. His gut said the latter. He flagged the waitress, asked for the check, and paid quickly. In the parking lot, as the drizzle turned to steady rain, he sat in his rental car and opened his work laptop. He typed up an incident report. Unusual conversation with older male passenger. Possible pre-travel stress indicators. Name unknown. Destination Denver. Flight unknown. Mentioned doing the right thing and alluded to potential future event. He sent the report up the chain. The next morning, the report reached a regional TSA inbox, but without identifying information or a confirmed threat, it was flagged as non-actionable. Just another vague interaction in a sea of thousands logged each year. Myers received a generic acknowledgement reply, then nothing more. Somewhere else that morning, Daniel stood quietly in line at SeaTac Airport, boarding pass in hand. He moved through security smoothly, his bag scanned, and passed without question. He showed no outward signs of nervousness, no contraband, no red flags. He was invisible again, just another man flying alone. What Myers didn't know, what no one knew, was that the moment he walked away from that booth, history had already begun to shift. A single conversation, easily dismissed, had brushed up against something enormous. A warning given, a warning ignored. And now, high above the mountains, that warning would echo louder than any could imagine. The seatbelt sign had just turned off when the first wave of unease passed through the cabin of Delta Flight 227. It wasn't anything loud or dramatic at first, just a subtle shift in atmosphere, a kind of collective breath hold among the passengers, like animals sensing an oncoming storm. Somewhere around row 19, a baby stirred and began to fuss, while a woman across the aisle rubbed her temples, wincing from the pressure change. A few passengers shifted in their seats, not from turbulence, but from something they couldn't name. And in seat 21A, Daniel Reed sat rigidly still, hands on his knees, eyes locked on the emergency exit just ahead of him. Caleb Nash, seated across the aisle in 21C, glanced over. A former Army Ranger turned security consultant, Caleb had spent the first 20 minutes of the flight scrolling through emails before noticing the man beside him. Something felt off. Daniel hadn't looked at his phone. He hadn't reached for a magazine, or even acknowledged the stewardess who offered him pretzels and ginger ale. His focus was absolute. Not anxious or fidgety. Intent. Controlled. Too controlled. Caleb leaned back slightly, just enough to observe Daniel without being obvious. The man's right hand twitched every few minutes, his thumb brushing the seam of his jeans in a repetitive motion. His breathing was shallow but even. No signs of panic. This wasn't someone afraid to fly. This was someone waiting for a moment. 2 rows ahead, the emergency exit loomed. Cool gray, labeled with red lettering, its lever locked tight in a casing. Caleb had taken enough flights to know it was nearly impossible to open midair, but he also knew enough about people to recognize when someone was circling a decision. He turned to the flight attendant walking down the aisle. Her name tag read Melissa. He waved her over, speaking quietly. "Excuse me, can I ask you something a little unusual?" She leaned in with a practiced smile. "Sure, how can I help?" "That man in 21A, he hasn't moved since we took off. Something about his behavior, it's off. Can you check if he's okay?" Discreetly. Melissa's smile faltered for just a second. Her eyes flicked to Daniel. She nodded. "I'll take a look." A few moments later, she approached Daniel's row, offering snacks again. "Sir, can I get you anything?" Daniel looked up. His eyes were calm, but something in them was distant, unreachable. "No, thank you," he said softly. Melissa lingered a second longer than necessary. "Are you feeling all right today?" "I'm fine," he replied. "Just tired." She gave a short nod and moved on, but when she reached the back galley, her voice came through the intercom to the flight crew discreetly. "Keep an eye on 21A. Passenger seems emotionally checked out. No disturbance, but trust your gut." 10 minutes passed. Then another 5. The plane droned steadily above the clouds. Caleb tried to return to his emails, but he couldn't shake the tension building in his chest. Every muscle in his body was on edge. Then, without warning, Daniel stood. It was not abrupt or violent. He rose smoothly, slowly, like someone getting up to stretch. But instead of turning toward the restroom or the overhead bin, he stepped forward, 1 pace, then 2, toward the emergency exit. "Hey," Caleb said sharply, rising to his feet. Daniel reached out, his hand touching the base of the emergency lever. Screams erupted. A woman shouted, "He's going for the door." Melissa dropped her tray in the aisle. The aircraft jolted, not from turbulence, but from chaos. Caleb surged forward and tackled Daniel into the wall. The duffel bag fell from his shoulder and slid down the aisle, its zipper popping halfway open. Caleb wrestled Daniel to the ground. The older man struggled, breath ragged, eyes wide, not in rage but sorrow. "You don't understand," Daniel gasped. "I have to. This isn't what you think." Melissa was on the intercom with the cockpit. "We have a passenger attempting to breach the emergency exit, requesting immediate diversion." "Repeat, immediate diversion." The captain's voice crackled. "Initiating emergency landing. Estimated time to Salt Lake City, 14 minutes. Passengers screamed. Others prayed. A mother clutched her child, shielding her from the scene. And through it all, Daniel's voice rang out, low but clear. "They need to see what's inside the bag." The captain's voice came over the intercom, steady but clipped with urgency. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. Due to an onboard security concern, we are making an emergency landing in Salt Lake City. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened. Cabin crew, prepare for descent." The tension that had already wrapped itself around the passengers now pulled tight like a rope on the verge of snapping. Screams gave way to stunned silence. The plane tilted gently, banking into a new course. Somewhere near the rear of the cabin, a man vomited into a paper bag. Children cried. A businessman muttered a prayer under his breath. But all eyes were on the narrow aisle where Daniel Reed lay pinned to the floor. Caleb Nash still had his knee on Daniel's back, one hand pressing his shoulder down while the other held a fistful of his jacket. Daniel had stopped struggling. He didn't resist, didn't speak again. He just lay there, breathing heavily, his cheek pressed against the carpet. Melissa, the flight attendant, stood nearby with a trembling hand holding the intercom phone, her knuckles white. A second flight attendant, Julian, ran down the aisle and retrieved the duffel bag that had slid toward row 17. "Should we open it?" he asked. "No," Caleb snapped. "We don't know what's in there. Could be explosives. Could be biohazard. Could be nothing. But let's not take any chances." Julian nodded, gently setting the bag on a seat and backing away. Another passenger in the row ahead reached for his phone. "Put that away," Melissa ordered. "No recording right now." Daniel shifted slightly beneath Caleb. "It's not a bomb," he rasped. "It's evidence." Caleb stared down at him. "You nearly caused a mid-air catastrophe, and you want us to believe this is some noble crusade?" "I didn't try to open the door," Daniel said. "I just needed someone to pay attention." "Well," Caleb muttered, "you got it." In the cockpit, the captain and first officer were coordinating with Salt Lake City International Airport. Emergency response units had been mobilized, fire trucks, law enforcement, hazmat teams. The FAA and TSA were alerted within minutes. A squad from Homeland Security was being assembled before the wheels even touched the ground. Back in the cabin, the descent grew steeper. The pressure shifted. The flight attendants hurried down the aisles, checking seat belts, instructing everyone to stay calm, but the tension refused to break. Eyes darted nervously from passenger to passenger. Fear had crept into every crevice of the aircraft. No one felt safe. Everyone was guessing. Caleb glanced out the window. The lights of Salt Lake City came into view, faint but steady through the thin cloud cover. The runway loomed ahead, flanked by blinking emergency vehicles. He took a deep breath, then leaned down to Daniel again. "You better hope there's something in that bag worth all this," he said. Daniel gave a weary nod. "There is, but it's not what you're expecting." The wheels slammed onto the tarmac with a heavy thud. The plane bounced once, then steadied. A chorus of gasps filled the cabin. Within seconds, the aircraft taxied off the main runway and came to a stop near a line of flashing red and blue lights. The engines whined as they powered down. Outside the windows, a swarm of men in tactical gear surrounded the plane, weapons drawn, communication devices buzzing in their ears. A voice crackled through the intercom. "This is the Salt Lake City Police Department. All passengers, remain seated with your hands visible. We will begin deplaning row by row under supervision. Do not move unless instructed." Two heavily armed officers boarded through the forward hatch, followed by a third in a hazmat suit, carrying a sealed case. They moved straight to Daniel, who remained face down, silent. Caleb slowly stood, hands raised, and backed away. The officers restrained Daniel with zip ties, lifted him to his feet, and began escorting him off the plane. "Please," Daniel said to no one in particular, voice breaking. "Just look in the bag. You'll see." One of the officers took the duffel carefully and followed the others down the aisle. Passengers watched in stunned silence, unsure whether they had just witnessed the foiling of a terror attack or the beginning of something far stranger. Outside, the night air was cold and sharp. The plane door opened, and Daniel Reed stepped into a wall of flashing lights and barking orders. Somewhere beyond the chaos, the truth waited, sealed inside that bag, and it would not stay hidden for long. The room was cold, the kind of cold that crept into your skin and settled in your bones. Daniel sat at a steel table under the sterile glow of fluorescent lighting. His hands were cuffed, resting lightly on the table, and a single camera blinked red from the upper corner of the ceiling. A one-way mirror took up half the wall, behind which a cluster of federal agents watched with growing impatience. It had been 4 hours since the emergency landing. Daniel had been processed, fingerprinted, and tested for explosives. The bag, his infamous duffel, had been rushed to a secure facility for analysis. The results were confounding. There were no weapons, no explosives, no chemical traces, no false compartments. Just papers, dozens of them, documents, handwritten notes, grainy photographs, names, places, times, dates, all jumbled in a chaotic arrangement that didn't make sense. At least, not yet. Agent Claire Hart, a 39-year-old veteran of Homeland Security, with a reputation for breaking tough cases, entered the room. She set a folder down on the table and sat across from Daniel. Her eyes studied him, his face, his posture, the subtle twitch in his left cheek. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't resisting. But there was a quiet fire in his expression that told her this wasn't over. "Mr. Reed," she began, voice measured, "you're in serious trouble. You interfered with a commercial flight, caused mass panic, and attempted to access a secured emergency exit mid-flight. That's enough to land you in federal prison for the rest of your life. So let me ask you plainly, what were you trying to do?" Daniel looked up slowly. "Get someone to listen. Why not go to the authorities before the flight? Why create a scene?" "I did go to the authorities 3 times. No one listened. No one called back. The people I named in my report, some of them work in the agencies I went to. Some of them are the reason this is happening." Hart opened the folder. Inside were photocopies of some of the documents found in his bag. Satellite images, military memos, maps of small towns in Colorado and Montana, reports with entire sections blacked out. It was a jumble of half-truths and conspiracy, unless, of course, it wasn't. "You're claiming this," she tapped the file, "is a threat. I'm saying it's already happening, and no one's stopping it. Be specific." Daniel leaned forward slightly. 4 years ago, I worked on a private logistics contract for a defense subcontractor out of Nevada. They ran convoys, moved classified materials, always through the back routes, state roads, mountain passes. No digital trail. I didn't think much of it at first. But then I started seeing patterns, deliveries to facilities that didn't exist on any public record. Employees who never spoke, never deviated. Sites that appeared and disappeared within weeks. Hart narrowed her eyes. "You think you uncovered some kind of covert operation?" "I know I did. And you believe it poses a threat?" "I believe it's gone rogue." He nodded toward the folder. "Those images? That's from satellite feeds I archived. The same cargo trucks show up across 5 states, always near towns where people go missing. Homeless, migrants, even veterans. People no one looks for. Then I found medical files, trials that weren't authorized by any ethics board. Blood samples, cognitive scans, behavioral models." Hart stared at him, the silence between them stretching. "This sounds like the kind of thing people post on conspiracy forums," she said at last. "Why should I believe you?" Daniel's voice dropped. "Because I buried the originals in a vault in Wyoming. GPS coordinates are in the papers you found. If you open that vault, you'll find records dating back 10 years. Names of contractors, congressional memos, video evidence. If I had simply emailed it or walked into a station, someone would have erased it. I had to make it public. I had to create an event." Hart studied him for a long moment, then stood. "You're either delusional or sitting on the biggest national security scandal in a generation." Daniel looked up. "I'm not the story. What's in that vault is." She turned and knocked once on the mirror glass. A moment later, the door opened. As she stepped out, a colleague handed her a phone. "The bag is clean," he whispered. "But the GPS coordinates? They check out. There's something buried out there, and it's not on any registry." Hart looked back at Daniel through the glass. For the first time, she felt it, a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. The black SUV rumbled off the last paved road and onto the gravel path winding deep into the Wind River Range of western Wyoming. Snow still clung stubbornly to the forest floor despite the arrival of spring, and the towering pines pressed in like sentinels, silent and watchful. Agent Claire Hart sat in the passenger seat, her jaw clenched, eyes fixed on the GPS tracker mounted to the dashboard. The coordinates Daniel Reed had given them pointed to a point precisely 37 miles from the nearest town. No structures, no cell service, no drone coverage, just wilderness. And, if Reed was telling the truth, a secret buried beneath it. 2 blacked-out SUVs followed close behind, each carrying a small tactical response team and field analysts. The mission was classified under the code name Operation Archive. Hart had insisted on leading it herself. There were too many variables, too many questions swirling in her head. And if this was what she suspected, what she feared, then it needed someone who wouldn't blink when the truth turned ugly. Quarter-mile ahead, the driver said, slowing as the gravel thinned to dirt and exposed rock. The vehicle pulled up to a clearing, just large enough for 3 cars to park. The air was still, unnaturally quiet. Hart stepped out and immediately felt the cold cut through her coat. The wind moaned through the trees. Her boots crunched on the frosted ground as she walked toward the spot. A technician was already scanning the terrain with a portable LiDAR device. After 5 minutes of silent work, he waved her over. "There's something down there," he said. 8 feet deep. Steel casing. Large, like a bunker hatch or reinforced container. Hart nodded. "Start digging." It took an hour, a team of 6, and a portable excavator flown in by chopper. When the last of the dirt was cleared, the team revealed a rectangular metal vault. Cold gray, rusted slightly around the edges but intact. Welded seams, a numeric keypad, and biometric scanner, both now dead from years of disuse. Hart stepped forward with a master decryptor in hand. The tech attached it to the port, ran a power bypass, and triggered the fail-safe override. There was a hiss, a low click, and then the sound of heavy bolts disengaging from within. The lid lifted with a slow, protesting groan, and what lay inside stunned them all. Binders, neatly stacked and labeled. Rows of hard drives, each numbered. Film reels in protective canisters. Plastic bags filled with microcassettes, blood vials, and hand-labeled Polaroids. At the center was a single laptop, dusty but wrapped in protective foam. Hart leaned in and pulled a folder marked Eclipse. She flipped it open. The first page was a memo dated 2009 from a private defense firm called Marken Dynamics to a Pentagon liaison. The subject line, Human Performance Optimization, Phase 2 Testing. Below were signatures from both parties and a green ink stamp, OFF Ledger. She kept reading. The project proposed neurological mapping of trauma victims and behavioral reprogramming using experimental compounds and virtual sensory immersion. It listed test sites, VA hospitals, remote shelters, undocumented detention centers. It documented trials that bypassed FDA approval, classified as military-civilian crossover experiments. One name kept repeating across multiple forms, Dr. Alan Vesco, a neuroscientist previously declared missing in 2017. Another folder detailed asset extraction protocols. It described using mobile transport units, unmarked convoys, exactly like the ones Daniel had described, to quietly remove test subjects from public spaces. No public records. No digital trail. Ghosted, the document called them. Hart's hands trembled as she opened another binder and found photographs. Men and women in hospital gowns, some unconscious, others screaming. Notes scrawled in margins. Subject non-compliant. Memory fracturing incomplete. On another, prototype retains hostility. Terminate. Behind her, one of the agents dry heaved. Hart stepped back, her mind racing. If this was real, and every piece of evidence said it was, then Daniel Reed hadn't just uncovered corruption. He'd uncovered crimes against humanity perpetrated under the veil of national defense. The sheer scope was staggering. She turned to her team. Secure everything. Double-layered containment. Get it prepped for airlift to Quantico. And make sure no one outside this operation breathes a word. "Yes, ma'am," an agent replied. As they sealed the vault back up and began moving materials to the helicopter, Hart stood at the edge of the clearing, staring out into the trees. Somewhere out there, in cities and towns across the country, victims were walking around without even knowing what had been done to them. Or maybe they weren't walking around at all. Either way, the truth had just clawed its way to the surface. And it was darker than she ever imagined. News doesn't travel slowly anymore. It moves like fire through dry grass, sudden, explosive, unstoppable. Less than 24 hours after Agent Claire Hart's team secured the contents of the Wyoming vault, something leaked. A single photo, a blurry scan of a classified memo with the words Human Performance Optimization, Phase 2 Testing stamped in red, appeared on a fringe conspiracy forum. Within an hour, it was on Reddit. By midnight, it was on X, formerly Twitter, trending worldwide under the hashtag #GhostProject. The government scrambled to control the narrative, but it was too late. At 7:43 a.m. Eastern Time, the president's press secretary stepped onto the White House podium and read from a carefully written statement. The Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Defense are currently investigating reports of unauthorized medical trials conducted by private contractors. We take these allegations with the utmost seriousness. Until the facts are established, we urge the public not to speculate. But speculation was already a wildfire. Cable news networks cleared their morning schedules. Pundits raged and speculated. Protesters gathered outside military bases. The internet fractured into factions. Some believed the documents were real. Others claimed it was a psyop or a distraction. Meanwhile, encrypted copies of the vault contents were quietly being shared among whistleblower journalists and rogue intelligence analysts. Claire Hart sat alone in a conference room deep in the Washington field office, watching the world unravel in real time. She hadn't slept. Her face was pale drawn. Her phone vibrated with dozens of messages, requests for interviews, offers for testimony, subpoenas already being drafted. But none of that mattered right now. What mattered was what they hadn't released. The worst files, the ones she still kept locked behind 2 layers of clearance. The files that contained not just documentation, but videos. One, dated June 2018, showed a test subject, a woman in her 30s, hooked up to a mesh of neural probes. Her arms were restrained. Her mouth gagged. As the test began, her vitals spiked violently. Then, she stopped responding entirely. Her eyes remained open. Heart rate steady. Brain activity flat. A doctor stepped in a frame and nodded. Stasis window confirmed. No resistance. Begin imprinting. Hart had to shut the video off halfway through. The footage was real. She'd seen things doctor before, but this had the weight of truth. And that terrified her more than anything else. Across town, Daniel Reed sat in a holding room under armed guard. He hadn't asked for a lawyer. He hadn't spoken to anyone, not even a gloat. But when Hart entered, he looked up and simply said, "It's out, isn't it?" She nodded. "Not everything." He studied her carefully. "Then you're still protecting them?" "No," Hart replied. "I'm protecting what's left of this country's ability to function without civil collapse." Daniel gave a dry laugh. "It's already collapsing. You just don't want to be the one holding the detonator." She didn't argue. He wasn't wrong. But it wasn't as simple as that. She had seen the ripple effect before. One leak spawning 1,000 misinterpretations, breeding fear, chaos, and violence. There were already reports of assaults on federal contractors. Hacktivist groups were threatening to release names, addresses. Retaliation was coming, and it wouldn't distinguish between the guilty and the innocent. "What do you want, Daniel?" she asked quietly. "What does justice look like to you?" He looked down at his hands. "Justice? No. Justice doesn't exist in a system that buries people. I want exposure. Sunlight. I want every person who signed off on those programs to sit in front of a Senate hearing and answer for what they did." Hart hesitated. Then she handed him a folder. "We're convening a closed-door inquiry. Congressional oversight. You'll testify under protection." "I don't want protection," Daniel said. "I want accountability." "You might get both," she replied, though her voice lacked conviction. That night, Claire Hart met with her superiors. She showed them the full contents of the vault. Their faces shifted from disbelief to horror to political calculation. The consensus: limited release, controlled messaging, and heavy redactions. But Hart had made a copy, and she wasn't sure if she could live with the weight of silence. The fallout had only begun. Outside, Washington buzzed like a beehive kicked into chaos. Protesters swelled in number. Media vans lined the streets. Something had cracked open, something old and rotting that had been buried too long, and there was no sealing it back. While the federal government scrambled to maintain control over the narrative, something else was happening beneath the surface, something the agencies hadn't anticipated. In encrypted chat rooms, through anonymous email chains, and across darknet message boards, a signal was spreading. A single message, copied and reposted hundreds of times, always with the same header. "If you've seen it too, you're not alone." Hashtag Ghost Project. Claire Hart first learned of it from a junior analyst in the cybercrime division. The analyst had tracked nearly 40 separate whistleblowers reaching out across various platforms, in less than 48 hours. Most were anonymous, but several had known security credentials, former employees of private defense contractors, ex-military intelligence, even one retired scientist from the CDC. They weren't posting theories. They were posting data, emails, access logs, medical records, operational schematics. Every piece seemed fragmented, incomplete on its own. But taken together, they formed a jagged, monstrous mosaic of covert experimentation and institutional neglect. One name surfaced again and again in these leaks: Dr. Alan Vesco, the same neuroscientist referenced in Daniel's vault documents. According to one source, he hadn't vanished in 2017. He'd gone underground, working under an alias for a black site called Facility Theta. No listed location, no paper trail, just a string of unconnected funding contracts and black budget expenditures. By the end of the week, the number of whistleblowers had grown to over 100. Claire Hart stood in a classified briefing room at DHS headquarters, watching a live visual feed of the growing network. Colored nodes represented leaks. Red lines connected them by source, date, and content type. The screen looked like a digital spiderweb spun across the country, from Seattle to Tampa, from Anchorage to Austin. These people aren't conspiracy theorists, said the cyber analyst presenting. They're professionals. Disillusioned, maybe. Angry. But most of all, they're coordinated. Who's leading them? Hart asked. The analyst hesitated. No one officially. But the language they use, the code phrases, they match what we found in Daniel Reed's original cache. We think he seeded the network years ago. Hart stared at the screen. He planned for this. Looks that way. Later that evening, she returned to Daniel's holding cell, now upgraded to a secure suite within an undisclosed federal site. He sat on the edge of a cot, staring at nothing in particular, looking more worn than ever. They're coming forward, she told him. People you've never met. Former colleagues. Contractors. Some are risking their lives. Why now? Daniel looked up slowly. Because they're tired of the lie, and they've been waiting for someone else to go first. You mean you? I was just the loudest match in a dry forest. Hart handed him a tablet, screen already open. A real-time forum filled with posts, files, testimonies, grainy footage. Some confirmed the experiments. Others hinted at operations even more disturbing. Daniel scanned them, silent. Then he said, "This is only a fraction of what's out there. I tried for years to build trust with these people. Told them when the time came, there'd be someone in the system who'd listen. Someone who'd make it real." Hart folded her arms. "And you think I'm that person? I think you're the only one left who hasn't tried to bury it." She didn't respond. Her silence was answer enough. Over the next 72 hours, the whistleblower network ballooned. Encryption tools were shared across platforms. VPN services spiked in sales. Open-source investigators began mapping the leaked data. Citizen journalists cross-referenced disappearances with logistics data. Patterns emerged. Towns that had suffered mysterious illnesses. Hospitals with sudden staff turnovers. Entire files of deceased test subjects, labeled as homeless or undocumented, surfaced with matching genetic profiles found in government biobanks. The picture grew darker. Some of the whistleblowers were being tracked. One went missing in Kansas. Another was found dead in an apparent overdose in New Mexico, his laptop wiped clean. The network reacted by fracturing into cells, adopting the same decentralized model used by insurgent groups and hacktivist collectives. Still, the flow didn't stop. It accelerated. Claire Hart sat in her office, staring at the full map. She knew what was coming. The public hadn't seen the worst of it yet, but the fuse was lit. She could feel it in her chest like a second heartbeat. What happens, she whispered to herself, when truth becomes more terrifying than the lie? The answer was already writing itself across every encrypted line of code, every whistleblower's trembling voice. It spreads. Washington was a battlefield of shadows and whispers. The revelation of the Ghost Project had unleashed a political maelstrom no one was prepared for, and the government's response was swift and ruthless. Behind closed doors, a series of covert operations unfolded, each designed to obscure the truth and regain control before the public's outrage became uncontrollable. Agent Claire Hart found herself caught in the eye of this storm. Her superiors summoned her repeatedly to clandestine meetings at the Pentagon, the Department of Homeland Security, and the CIA's headquarters. Each time, the message was clear: contain the narrative, discredit the whistleblowers, and dismantle the network before it spiraled further. They offered her promotions, perks, and veiled threats. Anything to secure her silence or cooperation. She refused every time. Meanwhile, the media was saturated with conflicting reports. Official spokespeople called the leaks fabrications, foreign disinformation campaigns, and a dangerous distraction. At the same time, investigative journalists who dug too deep were threatened or mysteriously silenced. 2 reporters from a prominent news outlet disappeared after receiving subpoenas, their last known locations untraceable. In the field, operatives began targeting key figures within the whistleblower network. Safe houses were compromised, encrypted servers were hacked, and encrypted messages were intercepted. One prominent whistleblower, a former contractor named Sarah Collins, was found unconscious in a parking garage with a fractured skull. Her testimony had detailed illegal human experiments and forced disappearances. Despite these efforts, the network refused to die. It adapted, grew more secretive, using complex decentralized communication methods that made tracing nearly impossible. Meanwhile, grassroots movements erupted nationwide, demanding transparency and justice. Protests filled the streets of major cities, from New York to Los Angeles, clashing with law enforcement and stirring political unrest. Claire received word that Daniel Reed's custody was being reconsidered. Officials worried that his testimony could spark a public relations disaster if he chose to speak freely. Yet, Daniel remained resolute. During a rare phone call, he told Claire, "They can silence me, but they can't silence what's already out there." The truth has a way of surfacing. Frustrated but undeterred, Claire used her access to quietly protect several whistleblowers, helping them relocate and provide evidence to trusted journalists. She became an unlikely guardian, navigating a perilous landscape between loyalty to the government and her own conscience. One night, Claire met with Daniel in a secure room. The air was thick with tension and exhaustion. "They're going after the people exposing this," she said. "If they succeed, everything we've uncovered will vanish." Daniel nodded grimly. "Which means we have to go further, deeper, find something so undeniable that even the highest powers can't suppress it." Claire looked at him, knowing the risks. "Where do we start?" He reached into his coat and pulled out a worn notebook, its edges frayed, pages filled with meticulous notes and sketches. "This," he said, "is the key. I documented a site they never expected us to find, an active facility still running experiments." Her heart pounded. "Where?" "Upstate New York, near the Finger Lakes. It's disguised as a research lab, but operates under strict military contract. We need evidence from there, photos, videos, anything that can't be disputed." Claire exhaled slowly. The path ahead was dangerous, the stakes higher than ever, but it was the only way. The next morning, Claire coordinated a small covert team to infiltrate the facility. Equipped with hidden cameras and secure communication devices, they planned to gather proof of ongoing human experimentation. As the sun set over the rolling hills of New York, Claire's team slipped past perimeter fences and security checkpoints. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed over rows of sterile chambers. Subjects, some conscious, others sedated, were monitored by scientists in white lab coats. Hidden in the shadows, Claire recorded everything. Faces twisted in pain, documents stamped confidential, and samples marked with coded designations. Suddenly, alarms blared. They had been discovered. Gunshots echoed through the corridors as Claire and her team sprinted toward their extraction point. Bullets whizzed past. A colleague fell behind. Panic surged. They burst out into the cold night air, breath ragged, hearts pounding. The extraction vehicle roared away just as security forces flooded the grounds. Back at the safe house, Claire watched the footage on a secure laptop. The images were harrowing, proof of illegal, ongoing experimentation on human subjects. This was the evidence they needed. But she also knew one thing clearly. The fight was far from over. The courtroom was packed, a stark contrast to the secrecy and shadows that had cloaked the Ghost Project for years. The trial of Daniel Reed and several high-ranking officials had become a national spectacle, gripping the United States in a collective frenzy. Cameras lined the hallways outside. Reporters whispered in anticipation, and protesters gathered both in support and opposition. Justice, or at least the appearance of it, was finally taking the stage. Agent Claire Hart sat silently near the prosecution's table, her expression taut with tension. She had spent countless hours preparing for this moment, coordinating evidence, and securing witness testimonies. The stakes were astronomical, not just for Daniel, but for the credibility of the government itself. The opening statements set the tone. The prosecution painted a chilling picture of a shadow program that violated every ethical boundary. Unauthorized human experimentation, kidnapping of vulnerable populations, and a systematic cover-up designed to protect national security interests at any cost. They introduced classified documents, medical files, and harrowing video footage from the vault in the New York facility. Each piece unraveled the facade of integrity the defendants had maintained. The defense, meanwhile, sought to undermine the prosecution's case by questioning the validity of the leaked documents and the credibility of the whistleblowers. They argued that national security necessitated difficult choices, that the experiments were part of vital research to protect the country from emerging threats, and that many of the subjects had volunteered or were part of controlled clinical trials. But the public was not buying it. The courtroom buzzed with emotion as testimonies revealed the human cost. The lost lives, the broken families, the silent suffering of those whose stories had been buried. When Daniel took the stand, his voice was steady despite the weight of years spent in custody. He recounted his role, the moral conflict that drove him to expose the truth, and the moments when he almost gave up hope. His words resonated deeply, turning a courtroom into a place of reckoning. Claire watched as jurors took notes, as judges leaned in, and as the nation listened. The trial was more than legal proceedings. It was a catharsis, a public unveiling of a wound that had festered in the nation's conscience. Amid the proceedings, new revelations surfaced, documents smuggled out by the whistleblower network that hinted at even broader involvement, implicating corporations, medical institutions, and foreign intelligence agencies. The case threatened to expand beyond the original defendants. Yet, in the halls of power, resistance remained fierce. Lobbyists pushed for plea deals. Politicians whispered behind closed doors about limiting the damage. There were threats to Claire's safety, anonymous warnings to Daniel, and subtle pressure on witnesses to recant. Still, the momentum could not be stopped. After weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for 3 days. When the verdict was finally read, the courtroom held its breath. Guilty on multiple counts: conspiracy, unlawful experimentation, kidnapping, and obstruction of justice. Daniel exhaled deeply, a complex mixture of relief and sorrow washing over him. Justice had been served, but the scars remained. Outside, crowds erupted in cheers and tears. The government announced sweeping reforms: new oversight committees, stringent ethical standards, and reparations for victims. Claire stood on the courthouse steps, watching the world shift beneath her feet. The battle had been won, but the war for truth, for transparency, was just beginning. The air was crisp that morning as Claire Hart walked out of the courthouse, a quiet sense of resolution settling over her like a balm. The trial had ended with verdicts that no one had dared hope for just months before. Daniel Reed's conviction was a turning point, not just a legal victory, but a symbol of accountability that had seemed impossible in the shadowed corridors of power. Yet, the work was far from over. As Claire stepped into the bright sunlight, she felt the weight of every life touched by the Ghost Project. The victims, many still unknown, would need healing, not just physically, but emotionally, psychologically, and socially. Families torn apart by years of silence, and lies deserved more than just justice. They deserved restitution and recognition. Back at DHS headquarters, Claire convened a task force charged with overseeing reparations, medical care, and psychological support for survivors and their families. Funding was secured from emergency government allocations, and partnerships were formed with independent advocacy groups and human rights organizations. It was a delicate balance, offering aid without reopening raw wounds or triggering further trauma. Meanwhile, Daniel's testimony and the whistleblower network had exposed vulnerabilities in the federal system. New legislation was drafted, creating robust safeguards for classified programs and enhanced whistleblower protections to prevent abuses of power from recurring. Congressional committees were established to oversee military research with transparent public reporting mechanisms. Claire often found herself reflecting on the paradox of their victory. The truth had been unleashed, but the revelations had fractured trust in institutions many depended upon. Rebuilding that trust would be the challenge of generations. It required transparency, humility, and an unwavering commitment to justice. One afternoon, Claire received a letter, handwritten and anonymous. It contained a simple message: "Thank you for listening, for fighting, for believing." Inside was a small photograph of a woman, eyes bright despite the hardships. It was from Sarah Collins, the whistleblower who had survived an attack, now living quietly under protection. The note reminded Claire that every step forward was fueled by countless unseen sacrifices. Outside her office window, the world moved on. Protests had dwindled, but awareness had deepened. Schools incorporated lessons about ethics in science and government accountability. Media outlets pursued investigative journalism with renewed vigor. Citizens demanded more from their leaders, refusing complacency. Claire decided to take a leave of absence. She traveled to a small town in Vermont where she grew up, hoping to reconnect with her roots and find clarity away from the chaos. Walking through the woods, breathing the pine-scented air, she allowed herself moments of peace she hadn't known in years. Yet, even in quiet, the past whispered. She knew others still suffered in hidden corners, their stories untold. The Ghost Project had been a symptom of a larger sickness, a warning sign of what happens when power is unchecked and secrets fester. One evening, while visiting a local community center, Claire met a group of young activists dedicated to transparency and justice. Their passion reignited something inside her, a reminder that change is born from relentless courage, not from silence or fear. Returning to Washington, Claire resumed her work with renewed determination. She became a public advocate for ethical oversight and a mentor to the new generation of whistleblowers and activists. Her name, once shrouded in secrecy, now stood as a beacon of integrity. Years later, looking back, Claire understood that the story of the Ghost Project was not just about darkness uncovered. It was about hope restored. The man who tried to open the emergency door had sparked a movement. What they found in his bag changed the course of history. And in that truth, they all found new beginnings. The investigation into the Ghost Project had uncovered layers of deception deeper than anyone imagined. But even as Claire Hart and Daniel Reed pressed forward, they soon realized they couldn't do it alone. Just as the public's attention began to wane and political pressures mounted to move on, an unexpected ally emerged from the shadows, a figure whose involvement would alter the course of their battle for truth. The first sign came in the form of an encrypted message sent anonymously to Claire's secure government email. The message was simple but compelling. "I have information that can blow the case wide open. Meet me at the Lincoln Memorial, midnight." It was signed only with the initials MS. Claire debated whether it was a trap, but decided that this lead couldn't be ignored. At midnight, she arrived at the Lincoln Memorial, the quiet grandeur of the monument lit only by soft moonlight. A tall figure approached, a woman, mid-40s, sharp-eyed and poised, dressed in a nondescript coat. "I'm Monica Steele," the woman said, voice low. "I work deep inside the Department of Defense's classified programs. I've seen what the Ghost Project has done, and I'm ready to help you expose everything." Monica was a former intelligence analyst who had quietly resigned after growing disillusioned with the government's clandestine operations. Over months, she had collected documents, internal memos, and recordings that directly implicated powerful military contractors and government officials in continuing unethical experiments, even after Daniel's trial. With Monica's help, Claire and Daniel gained access to data that had been buried in the darkest corners of classified databases. Her knowledge of secure networks and insider protocols allowed them to decrypt files previously thought impossible to access. The evidence was explosive. Names, dates, locations, and precise details of operations involving unauthorized human testing and manipulation of biological agents. But Monica's involvement came with risks. Her past was murky. She had been part of the system they were fighting. Trust was fragile, yet her dedication was undeniable. Claire watched carefully as Monica provided information that connected dots no one else had seen, revealing a vast, ongoing network of illegal research projects spread across multiple states. Together, they pieced together how the government had tried to restart parts of the Ghost Project under different code names, using contractors in remote facilities disguised as pharmaceutical companies and biotech startups. Monica's insider perspective helped identify key players still active, some of whom had infiltrated regulatory agencies to suppress investigations. This new alliance breathed fresh life into the movement. Claire and Daniel organized a covert meeting with the most trusted members of the whistleblower network, including Sarah Collins and other survivors. The goal was to strategize a coordinated release of the new evidence to media outlets worldwide. As the day of the release approached, tension was palpable. The government's efforts to discredit whistleblowers intensified, and Claire's phone was tapped, her movements monitored. Monica advised extreme caution, helping the team use encrypted communication methods and secure drop points to share information safely. Finally, the explosive evidence hit the headlines. The expose revealed ongoing illegal activities, contradicting previous government denials and sparking fresh outrage. Investigations reopened in multiple states, congressional hearings were convened, and calls for systemic reform intensified. Monica's courage inspired others inside the system to come forward, emboldened by her example. Former insiders and contractors began anonymously contributing additional documents and testimonies. The momentum shifted decisively toward transparency and accountability. Despite the risks, Claire found hope in this unexpected alliance. It proved that even those once complicit could choose to stand for truth. And in their combined strength, the ghosts of the past began to lose their hold. The road ahead was still long and uncertain, but with Monica Steele by their side, Claire and Daniel felt more ready than ever to finish what they had started, to open every locked door and bring light to every hidden corner. The tension in Washington had never been thicker. The cascade of revelations fueled by Monica Steele's insider information had shaken the foundations of power, but Claire Hart knew the most dangerous moment was still to come. Hidden in the newly uncovered data was a secret so explosive it threatened to topple the very highest echelons of government. A revelation that would forever alter the nation's understanding of the Ghost Project and its true purpose. As the sun set behind the Capitol dome, Claire and Daniel met in a secure room deep within the Justice Department's building. Monica laid out the final pieces of the puzzle she had unearthed, a series of encrypted files detailing a covert operation codenamed Prometheus. Unlike earlier projects that focused on unethical human experimentation, Prometheus was designed as a biological weapon program that had crossed every imaginable moral boundary. The files revealed that Prometheus was not just about defense. It involved deliberate manipulation of pathogens to create superviruses engineered for targeted population control. Worse, several field tests have been carried out on unsuspecting civilian populations within the United States under the guise of medical research, leading to unexplained outbreaks and mysterious illnesses in small communities. Daniel's face hardened as he scanned the documents. This changes everything. It wasn't just unethical science. It was weaponized disease, tested on our own people. Monica nodded grimly, and the program was approved at the highest levels. Some of those responsible are still in power. Claire's mind raced. If this information became public, it would trigger national panic, international condemnation, and possibly even legal actions on a scale never seen before. Yet, hiding it was no longer an option. Over the next 48 hours, the team prepared meticulously. The plan was to leak the files to trusted journalists simultaneously worldwide, ensuring no single entity could suppress the truth. Monica used her connections to establish multiple secure channels for transmission. Claire coordinated with activists and whistleblowers to amplify the message. When the revelations broke, the public response was immediate and intense. Headlines screamed of government betrayal, biological warfare on home soil, and a conspiracy of silence stretching back decades. Protests erupted in every major city, demanding resignations, criminal investigations, and reparations. Politicians scrambled to respond. Some denied knowledge. Others called for emergency sessions of Congress to investigate. Several high-ranking officials mysteriously resigned or disappeared from the public eye. The media cycle was relentless, dissecting every angle and implication. Amid the chaos, Claire and Daniel found themselves both praised and vilified. Supporters hailed them as heroes, while detractors labeled them traitors or terrorists. Their lives were irrevocably changed, yet their commitment never wavered. Behind the scenes, a task force was assembled to dismantle the remaining elements of Prometheus and the Ghost Project. Trials were initiated for those implicated in authorizing and executing these programs. New legislation was swiftly enacted to ensure strict oversight and transparency for any future classified research. As weeks passed, the country began the painful process of healing. Survivors of the experiments received medical aid and counseling. Public trust, though severely damaged, started to rebuild through sincere government efforts and community engagement. In a quiet moment, Claire stood overlooking the Washington Monument, reflecting on the journey from the moment Daniel Reed tried to open the emergency door on that fateful flight to the revelations that had rocked the nation. What they found in his bag was more than just evidence. It was a catalyst for truth, justice, and reform. The battle had been long and perilous, but in exposing the darkest corners of the Ghost Project, they had illuminated a path forward, one where accountability and humanity could finally prevail. Months had passed since the final revelation shook the nation, and the landscape of justice and truth was beginning to take form. Claire Hart sat quietly in her modest office at the Department of Justice, a soft glow from the desk lamp illuminating folders filled with reports, testimonies, and letters from survivors. Each page told a story of pain, resilience, and hope, a testament to the human spirit's refusal to be silenced. Daniel Reed's conviction had set legal precedents that sent shockwaves through the corridors of power, but was the ongoing efforts at reform and healing that Claire believed truly mattered. Government agencies had been restructured with increased transparency. A new oversight commission was established, staffed with independent experts tasked with monitoring classified research and ensuring ethical compliance. Claire often received visits from survivors and family members seeking answers or closure. She listened to their stories, some heart-wrenching, others inspiring, knowing that while legal justice was vital, emotional and social healing required something more profound: acknowledgement and understanding. Many had endured years of doubt and neglect. Now, their voices were finally being heard. One afternoon, Daniel was released on parole after serving his sentence. His trial and time behind bars had been arduous, but it had also been a crucible for his own transformation. He was greeted by Claire outside the prison gates, the autumn leaves swirling around them like a new beginning. They shared a quiet moment. No speeches, just a shared understanding of the journey they'd endured. Daniel had become an advocate for whistleblowers and ethical science, dedicating himself to preventing abuses like those he had fought against. Together, he and Claire began collaborating on public awareness campaigns, speaking at universities and civic groups about the dangers of unchecked government secrecy and the importance of courage in the face of injustice. Meanwhile, Monica Steele had disappeared from the public eye again, her work done but her legacy enduring. Claire never forgot the night they met at the Lincoln Memorial, a meeting that had changed everything. Monica's bravery reminded her that redemption was possible, even for those once entangled in darkness. Reparations programs have been launched to support victims of the Ghost Project's experiments, including medical treatment, counseling, and financial compensation. Community outreach efforts help survivors reconnect with their families and rebuild shattered lives. The nation, though scarred, was committed to making amends. Claire herself found solace in small moments. A letter from a survivor expressing gratitude, a quiet walk through a city park, a conversation with a child learning about ethics in school. These were signs that change was real and lasting. In a symbolic gesture of closure, a memorial was erected near the site of the original Ghost Project facility in New York. It stood as a tribute not only to those who suffered, but also to the enduring strength of truth and justice. Claire attended the dedication ceremony alongside survivors, families, and advocates, feeling the weight of history and hope intertwined. The journey had not been easy. Friends had been lost, enemies made, and sacrifices demanded. But the fight to open that emergency door, both literal and metaphorical, had revealed a deeper truth about resilience, accountability, and the power of ordinary people to challenge extraordinary darkness. As she watched the sunset that evening, Claire felt a quiet peace. The scars of the past would never fully fade, but the future was theirs to shape. Redemption was not just about punishment or apology. It was about rebuilding, learning, and moving forward together. And in that, there was hope. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, bathing the nation in a soft, hopeful glow. For Claire Hart, the journey that had begun with a man trying to open an emergency door on a commercial flight had finally come full circle. The weight of years of secrecy, pain, and sacrifice had lifted, replaced by the promise of a new beginning. Not only for her, but for the country itself. Washington, D.C. was slowly transforming. The legislative reforms born from the Ghost Project scandal were taking root, reshaping how classified programs were managed. A culture of transparency, once thought impossible in the realm of national security, was becoming a reality. Independent oversight committees held regular hearings, and whistleblower protections had been strengthened to safeguard those who dared to speak out. Claire stood on the steps of the Capitol building, watching the steady flow of citizens, activists, survivors, students, and officials gathered to mark the anniversary of the Ghost Project's exposure. The event was part remembrance, part celebration, a tribute to those who suffered in silence, and a testament to the courage that brought their stories to light. Daniel Reed, now a respected advocate, was speaking nearby, his voice steady and passionate as he recounted the journey from fear to justice. Monica Steele, having resurfaced briefly for the occasion, stood beside him, her presence a quiet reminder of the sacrifices made behind the scenes. Together, they symbolized a coalition forged not by convenience, but by an unyielding commitment to truth. Claire's heart swelled with a mixture of pride and humility. She remembered the first time she saw Daniel attempt to open that emergency door, a moment that sparked a chain reaction beyond anyone's expectations. What they found in his bag was more than evidence. It was the key to unraveling a web of lies and corruption that had spanned decades. But beyond the headlines and courtrooms, the real victory was in the lives touched and changed. Survivors found community and support. Families reunited after years of silence. Educational programs now taught ethics and accountability, ensuring that future generations would understand the importance of vigilance and moral courage. Claire had returned to her roots, balancing her work with moments of quiet reflection. She often walked the streets of her hometown, finding peace in the ordinary rhythms of life that once seemed so distant. The scars of the past remained, but they no longer defined her or the nation. Looking ahead, Claire envisioned a future where openness and justice would prevail over secrecy and oppression. The emergency door that Daniel had tried to open was no longer just a symbol of fear and confinement. It was a beacon of hope, a gateway to a world where truth could not be locked away. As the crowd dispersed and the sun rose higher, Claire felt a profound sense of renewal. The darkest chapters had been written, but a new story was beginning, one of healing, resilience, and unwavering hope. The dawn had truly arrived. The journey of uncovering the truth behind the Ghost Project was a testament to courage, resilience, and the power of ordinary people standing up against extraordinary darkness. From a moment Daniel Reed tried to open that emergency door to the revelations that shook a nation, this story reminds us that bravery can ignite change and that even the smallest act of defiance can lead to justice and hope. Thank you so much for joining me on this unforgettable journey. Your time and attention mean the world. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think, please don't hesitate to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your feedback helps us bring more stories like this to life. Remember, every story has the power to change the world. Thank you for being part of this one.